So hi, we're here with Dr. Russell J. Stambaugh, PhD, and he is a psychotherapist, asex sex therapist, certified sex therapist supervisor, and a kink advocate, kink aware therapist and advocate. So we wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your work, and we'll just get right to it. What are 5 things you wish all therapists knew about kink?
I think the things that I'm most interested in people taking away from this interview is that in most instances, kink is not psychopathological. It's not a disease. It's not a mental disorder. And for a lot of people, it's not a problem. And we've known this for quite a while. There's been about 10 years of good research and even longer track record of not so good research, all of which point to the idea that kink is not psychopathology. And we're starting to get some changes in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Mental Disorders from the American Psychiatric Association that reflects that. And there are changes pending in the ICD-11, which is a revision of the diagnostic codes used for all medical diagnoses, including mental health ones, that are going to drop the consensual paraphilias, as they're called in those manuals, from the list of mental disorders. So first and foremost, and there are plenty of young professionals and people who work in the field who know this, but lots of people who were trained 5 or more years ago are not aware of that, and in fact continue to work under the illusion that if somebody is into something that doesn't look to them like what it is that's ordinary, they think it's aberrant. And that brings me to the second point that I would want to make about kink, is that although the manuals defined it as aberrant, and we're dropping that, there's sound psychological evidence, statistical and research evidence to suggest that having fantasies of power and domination, of submission, of masochism and sadism are in fact very, very common. A recent study by Christian Joyal conducted in Quebec showed that 80% of people had, and the people were a random sample of Quebecois. There's no strong reason to believe that Quebecois are that different from Americans or other Westerners in how tolerant they are of kink fantasies or how many of them they have. But if we define aberrant as something that only 2% of the population has or less, 80% is a lot more than 2. That means almost everybody has it. And when Joyal did his study, over 90% of the people had admitted to sexual fantasies about having sex with a partner with whom they're strongly romantically connected, and a very large percentage like to do it in secluded romantic places like on the beach. But so that gives you a bit of a baseline. And the only thing that he found to be actually aberrant was sexual relations with children under the age of 14. Only 2% of his sample admitted to that. So this gives you an idea that really we've been laboring under the social illusion that sexual fantasies about dominance and submission and sadism and masochism and transvestism and all of that is really very, very weird and odd, when in fact it's quite typical. So what's aberrant here is our social judgments about those things rather than their statistical frequency among a random sample of North Americans. And part of this reflects the fact that by history, kink and BDSM and consensual non-monogamy and really anything besides missionary positions, sex between married partners done deep in the privacy of one's own home while the children are asleep, has been highly stigmatized. And part of it is because we think that aggression is scary. Partly is because we don't have a conversation about power. One of the ways people maintain power is by not having people talk about why and how they have it. So the stigma associated with this means that we've completely misunderstood what people are actually thinking and feeling. And that's a very poor position from which to try to do good therapy with them, or even to provide ordinary social understanding and acceptance. Um, pathologizing kink. My fourth point would be the pathologizing kink and stigmatizing it are huge barriers to treatment. If somebody comes in and the first thing you hear about is that they like to needle play, and you say, "Oh my gosh, no wonder you're so depressed. You've been stabbing yourself. You must be guilt-ridden to be able to even be able to tolerate the idea of inflicting pain on yourself for no reason." That's a huge barrier to somebody being able to talk to you about what's really going on for them. Lots of people who are kinky have the same kinds of psychological problems that people who aren't kinky, considering the fact that 80% of people have kink fantasies. Ordinary people and kinky people aren't really very different. That probably explains all those research results that we found about why people aren't pathological, because they're not different, because there's so many of them. But for all of that, if you immediately target the fact that somebody's into some kind of alternative sexual behavior and say that must be the explanation for whatever it is that's bothering them, it's not impossible that that really is the explanation. But often they're bothered for the same kinds of reasons, between losses of everyday life, to childhood abuse history, to chemical imbalances in their neurobiology. Given those causes, those things don't have anything to do with their kink, and you'll misunderstand them and also make them defensive about being able to talk openly about not just their kink, but whatever the presenting problem is that they came in for. The last misconception about BDSM is that if you are a practitioner and you're trying to be open, that you can solve most people's problems by giving them a little bibliotherapy and packing them off to the nearest BDSM social organization where they'll get fabulous education and training in how to do their kink better. It is possible for people to get a great deal out of joining BDSM social organizations, so there's some reasons why people might not do that, including having social positions in which they have strong reason to be afraid of being outed, to not being very exhibitionistic or voyeuristic, and not being comfortable expressing their sexuality around strangers who they would have to get to know first before they could do any of those fun things they've been fantasizing about, but having some kind of problem with. So you don't solve people's problems as a therapist simply by referring them to a really good book, even though reading good books is often a good idea. And frankly, the people we see who are from BDSM social organizations already tend to be pretty well read and pretty intellectual. There's some not terribly well validated evidence to suggest that they are as intelligent or more intelligent than the average population. And I can't really tell whether that's because they're really smarter or whether we're simply getting a hold of the smart ones because they're in the same pathways we're in. They're on the same internet. They're coming in for therapy. They have enough money so they can afford to treat these things. And people who are intersectional and disadvantaged, we may not be seeing. And so since they look like us, we think they're smart. Well, some of us are really smart, but we may simply be expressing our confirmation bias to say how smart they are. But a lot of the people in kinky social organizations are better read, and if you give anybody who comes in the door something to read, that may or may not be helpful. They may actually feel that's more like you're putting them off, and that you don't really know what you're talking about on the topic, rather than that you want to hear about it from them. One of the main things that makes therapy effective is getting people to listen to themselves. And so anything that you do that might put a barrier between them talking to you about what's really going on for them is not a good treatment technique. You would rather they were talking to you and listening to themselves at the same time. Now, a lot of people come to you and talk to you like you're the Wizard of Oz, and if they just tell you what the problem is, you'll fix it for them. And people who are in kinky organizations are generally pretty good about not doing that. They tend to accept a fairly high degree of personal responsibility to be resisting stigma enough to be out and to join such organizations. But not everybody who comes into therapy is that way at all. Lots of people are thinking, well, you're the expert and you're going to be able to guide them. It is true about people who are into kink that they learn things about the world and they learn things about their kink from experience, even if they read about it in books. And what you're learning from books and what you learn from experience aren't the same. And so if you just try to fob book people off on books and you're not prepared to have the experience of talking about it and feeling it in the treatment, that's going to be a barrier to people learning anything. And it's probably a particular barrier for kinky people. So those are the 5 things that I would want sex therapists and general therapists to know about BDSM. And I'm sure some of you who are wise enough to be listening to this tape already know that. But there are plenty of people out there in the world of mental health and the world of even of sex education who don't know these things, in part because, frankly, it's very, very hard to get a good sexologically informed education in American colleges and universities.
What are some common misconceptions that general therapists have about sex in general?
Well, as I said before, the first is that they probably can treat it and they don't need any additional advanced training in sexology. That'd be the first thing that I wish that general therapists knew, is that specialty training is necessary and it's worthwhile to do that. The other thing that I wish was different is that there were training institutions within academia that did this training. I just saw a list of qualified sexology doctoral programs in the United States, and there are as many of those in the United States as there are in all of Canada. So that gives you an idea just how hard it is for people to establish this within academia. And this, of course, is a result of sexual stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And to work in an area that is that stigmatized with the assumption that you already know all that you need to, when you yourself may not have gone through that, that's a big problem. Another thing I would want people to not, another mistake I would not want general mental health professionals to make, is to make the assumption that you need to be kinky in order to be able to treat somebody who's kinky. What you need to do is know something about kink, and you need to know a fair amount about it. It's not like there's nothing to learn here. And that if I think it's not okay to just turn people over to kink social organizations and let them fix problems, and there are some problems which they're great at fixing, so it's not like you should never refer anybody to them. The other thing I would want mistake I wouldn't want people to make, is to assume that if people just find community, the problems will take care of themselves. Bipolar affective disorder is not going to be fixed by going into by having a really good relationship with some people in a kink community. And there are problems in kink communities, just like there are problems in non-kinky communities. Sometimes there's predation. Sometimes there's people take on roles in those organizations, and their commitment to trying to be good at their roles gets in the way of their sexual pleasure. Sometimes there's conflict. People think their kink is better than everybody else's kink, and sometimes people fight for stupid organizational reasons. So just going into somebody else's organization and saying that'll fix it, maybe it will, but it isn't automatically going to do that. So when somebody comes to you and they think that psychotherapy is needed, they're probably right. They're not always right. And that so it's important to listen to them and take them seriously. So it's possible to make the mistake of thinking you know more than you do, and to treat people with whom you're not really culturally competent. But it's also possible to think that you have less to offer than you really do. There's real expertise behind being an effective mental health professional. And just dealing people off because they're different is another way of providing inadequate care.
So you write a really amazing blog called Elephant in the Hot Tub. And you have some great information and great educational pieces on there. And I was wondering how and why you started that.
I started it that way for a number of reasons. One is I thought it was a good idea to do a book. But on the other hand, I had a problem with who the audience should be for the book. Because on one hand, I thought that it was important for kinky people to know a little bit more about how psychotherapists do what they do. And if I wrote a professional book, hardly any of them would read it. And if I wrote about kink in an entirely professional way, I was afraid that talking with the proper voice of respectable authority would put therapists off from empathizing with the client group they were likely to encounter. It's not that you don't treat people in kink as an authority, yourself a master's degree in something or a PhD in something. You are setting yourself up as a bit of an authority. But the truth of the matter is there's a lot of stuff you're not going to know about kink. And that's true even if you're already kinky and you're involved in kink organizations. Because kink is so broad and so diverse, there's going to be some things you like and some things you don't like and some things you expose yourself and some things you don't expose yourself to. And if you are absolutely the authority on intense needle play, that doesn't mean you know anything about furries.
Oh, right.
And if you do know something about furries and you know all about how your local furry community works, it doesn't necessarily mean that the one person who came from Seattle knows the same thing about their furry community that they were involved in theirs. They moved to Texas. So, it's important not to assume that you know more than you do. But I thought by approaching it from a more, trying to make it more approachable, that would be a good thing. So there's a lot of humor in it, and there's a lot of pictures in it, and there's a lot of nerd culture that's been blended in. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap between people who are into nerd culture and people who are into BDSM, but not everybody. There's a lot of overlap between BDSM and consensual non-monogamy, but not everybody overlaps. And there's a lot of overlap between gender fluidity, transgender communities, and GLBT with BDSM too, but people tend to form different communities. So there's some kinds of communities that are much more gay leather oriented and others that are much more heterosexually oriented, and they have different cultures. So I was trying to write something that was broad enough, general enough, and open to all approaches enough so that people who are in the community would be interested enough to read it, and that people who read it as therapists wouldn't feel like they were reading journal articles. And there are references to journal articles. You can go read the journal articles. That's a really good idea. I strongly recommend journal articles. I'm not against using the best scientific information that you can to inform your practice, but I try to talk about it in a broader way and make it fun enough so that it's entertaining and approachable at the same time. It is mainly for people who are doing treatment for people who are into alternative sexualities, but it's meant to be approachable to a larger audience. And it can be found at elephantinthehottub.
elephantinthehottub.com.
Or at blogspot.com. Either way, you can either search for it using Elephant in the Hot Tub : kink in context, or elephantinthehottub.blogspot.com. So think about how you get there. It may yet become a book, but it's stylistically very unlike a proper professional mental health book.
So, Russell, who are your sexual role models?
Well, in terms of doing Elephant in the Hot Tub, probably nobody, because nobody else is doing that, and I'm the only person who's doing it. So I would be unique in that. But in terms of my role models in being into human sexuality at all, I was originally trained in a very Freudian program. And that Freudian program was pretty judgmental about kink. So in some ways, I defied some of my role modeling. But one of my role models intellectually is Sigmund Freud. And why is not because Freud made flawless decisions about human sexuality, but that he made the decisions he did about what to write about and how to investigate it and how to get people thinking about human sexuality in the context of the late Victorian period and the cultural context he was in. Kink in context is all about context, and for him to be thinking that way in that context was really, in some ways, inevitable, thanks to Darwin, and also extremely innovative. And he was a maverick. And I guess I'm a bit of an outsider myself, and I like to think I like people who are mavericks, who are thinking outside of the box. And the fact that he made some mistakes, he also got some things right that are extremely important. And of all the people who I have read, he's probably the most influential single person in how we know who we are here in what we, foolishly characterized as modernity. It's probably the single biggest contributor to how we think about ourselves. So he invented talk therapy, of course, and talk therapy of a very particular kind, but that was the heck of an achievement. Another really important role model is Foucault, Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was a gay sociologist come philosopher. And one of the things that he said, and he was a critic of Freud, in fact, is that, all this discussion about how sex is bad and how people aren't supposed to talk about sex and what have you is all a load of hooey. It's really a big boondoggle by professionals to try to make it legitimate for them to talk about sexuality in a way where they could get their jollies while at the same time having power and control over it and not get judged for being able to get close to what it is that interests them. It's a power play. And as somebody who has worked in the hierarchy of ASECT to try to make ASECT a better guild, the truth of the matter is professional guilding plays a very important role. You've heard me talk about how important it is to have sexological expertise. Well, that's the kind of thing that people have been saying in guilds since they had an alchemist guild and you had to have expertise in how to turn lead into gold. Some of it was hooey, but the fact is professionalism is in some ways a scam and in some way is important and legitimate and creates the authority and creates the space where it's possible for you to help people. So being critical of yourself as a professional is a crucial piece of being effective as a therapist, whether you're working with kinky people or whether you're working with ordinary people. Doesn't matter whether they're conventional or not. And many of the biggest mistakes we've made as professionals are that we assumed we knew too much and we had too much authority and we imposed our values without having examined them. So Foucault is the perfect person to be the antidote to the kinds of mistakes that Freud made. So I have two mutually opposing intellectual role models.
What about personal role models for your own life?
Having been trained in a very formal, very demanding clinical program that was very Freudian, it was a big deal for me to see that sexology was a legitimate field of practice and wasn't really just about people trying to pursue sexual license. And so two of my big role models are Beverly Whipple and Dennis Segru. And they're people who, when I came to ASECT and I saw their work and I saw their professionalism and I saw how they talked about sexuality, I realized that this was a legitimate field and it wasn't just people arguing for sexual freedom. And I have tried to be that way too. Even though I work for the National Coalition of Sexual Freedom, I'm not just for sexual freedom so people can do anything they want, whether it's good for them or not. I'm there because stigma damages people, and it would be better if people had freedom and therapy is really about giving people more freedom in how it is that they pursue the decisions in their lives. So it's not that I'm not in favor of freedom, but I'm also in favor of using that freedom thoughtfully, responsibly, and with a certain amount of discipline. And when I say discipline, I'm not talking about the kind of discipline as embodied discipline, but discipline is talked about in the kink community too. Kink isn't just about doing anything you want. It's about defining anything you want and then having the discipline and making the sacrifices that are necessary to achieve that. Because you don't just go into a kinky organization and start wailing away at people with a riding crop and have a good time. It doesn't work that way. You have to understand who they are, why they want what they want. You have to get their consent. You have to give your consent to do what they want to do with you. And you have to do it in a place from within yourself that means that you could really have hope of getting your needs met and taking care of somebody in a thoughtful, respectful, loving way. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do that, then it's entirely possible to have bad adventures in the kink community, just as it's possible to have bad adventures in the conventional community. So the people in ASECT who convinced me that ASECT was serious business and sexology was serious business made it possible for me to stop just being a guy hung around by the couch all the time and went out into the real world and looked at what real world experience, where that meets all that other great stuff I learned in books.
So for someone who maybe wants to work with clients who are exploring kink, or maybe they're already in the scene, obviously we recommend them to go out and get training in this, in alternative sexualities. What else would you recommend for those individuals to do? I mean, you mentioned that they don't have to be kinky themselves in order to work with clients, but would it be important for them to go to events, munches, or conferences, or even a play party? What is your opinion on that?
Well, you know, you need to get people's permission to go to all those spaces. But yes, the fact is that kink is embodied sexuality. It's not just reading the Marquis de Sade or the Story of O or 50 Shades of Grey. And if you look at all the great erotic works about kink, most of them are fairly bad training about how to do kink, even when they're terrific about the psychology of kink. And of course, different people resonate to different things. And so if I listed 3 things there and you love all of them, that's pretty unlikely. You're like, you know, if you like one of them, you might not like some of the others. I didn't pick things that were perfectly identical as literature resources. And that's one of the reasons why offering people books is a dangerous thing. You know, you can give them a book, and if it doesn't connect with them, they think, well, this person doesn't know what the heck I'm talking about. So, but because kink is embodied, and it gets embodied different ways in what people want, it looks very, very different when people are doing fairly similar looking things. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know and understand that context, then you don't understand what it really means to that person, and that gets in the way of your being able to do it as a therapist. That you can make that mistake as a kinky therapist. If, let's say, you're a person who's already into the world of kink, and you say, well, this is what it means for me, it must mean that way for the next person. That works if the person is really like you, and it fails if they're not like you. So part of this is about stretching your ability to empathize with a broader group of people than people who are exactly like yourself. And that is a mistake that novices make. They say, well, I'm going to go out and, I was mistreated as a kid about my sexuality, and it really hurt my feelings. I'm going to go and I'm going to make the world a better place by fighting stigma. Fighting stigma is a really good idea. That's not a bad reason to want to go do it. There's a lot of people who fight stigma for exactly that reason. But stigma doesn't affect everybody the same way, and different people use it in different ways. And one of the places that you see that in kink is there's a big debate about whether humiliation is a perfectly okay fun kink, or whether there's something pathological about wanting to be humiliated. If you're a mental health worker and you spend all your time trying to keep people from being stigmatized, and then they're going out and saying, well, I want to be shamed for putting on panties of the pants of the other gender, clothing of the other gender. You say, well, but you shouldn't want to do that because it just shows you've internalized. It's like internalized homophobia. You've got internalized kink phobia. That ever could happen, but it's also true for a lot of people that shame empowers their sexuality. Mm-hmm. For some people, shame is a complete obstacle and they can't have what they want because of shame. And for other people, it's the touchstone to what it is that they want. If you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to be effective. How are you going to know that? Well, you have to see a fair amount of different people doing different things. And you have to tolerate your own discomfort about the things that they do that you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. The other day, I saw a video on the internet in which a bunch of Chinese people were climbing up one of these amazing karstic pinnacles in the, it's like a landscape, Chinese landscape painting. And this thing looked like it could easily have come right out of Bryce Canyon. Great, big, tall rock. And in the tall rock, there were little tiny metal footholds that you had to jump from one to the next while hanging on to another one at the same time. It was like somebody done a really professional job of building a rock climbing activity in a gym, except that it was 1,000 feet up, and you cross between one pinnacle and next on a wire with 2 guide wires. Anybody who has any acrophobia at all would look at that and say, oh my God, that's the scariest thing in the world. I wouldn't do that in a million years. And that's what I looked at, and that's exactly what it is that I thought. And I'm not even that afraid of heights, but I'm afraid enough of heights that I wouldn't do that. You have to get past the fact that in kink you're going to see something and you're going to say, I wouldn't want to do that. And then you're going to want to say, that's crazy. And it could really be crazy for you. And it really could be the hottest thing ever for somebody else. And until you're ready to tolerate that truth, then that's a limit on how effective you're able to be with people who come in through the door. You have to be able to put up with people who are in a fundamentally different position than you are and still have enough empathy and understanding for what they're doing that you can help them when they have problems with it.
Sure. It's about accepting what turns them on, what they enjoy, and although it might squick us out or make us really uncomfortable, we have to be able to tolerate it and not only tolerate it but accept it as something that maybe will really help them in their relationship, help them in their own sexuality, help them in their life, perhaps, or something that they just really enjoy and they really like at the moment. And so us acknowledging that, and I mean, of course, with all of this, everything that we're talking about, not pathologizing it, which is what a lot of general therapists do, which is why we're providing a training for this, is that to gain a better understanding of people who are practicing alternative sexualities, practicing kink.
That's our vocabulary word for the day, squicked. I gave you an example of being squicked without actually having used the word, because I'm afraid lots of people who see this would never have heard that word before. But it happens all the time that people in the kink community get squicked by what some other person in the kink community does.
And you can't unsee it.
That's exactly right. I can't unsee this video of Chinese people putting their lives at risk to climb up to some high place. It would probably be better to have seen a really good digital photo of. But never mind that. They wanted to do it and they get to do that. And, surely I can empathize with the feeling of triumph they have when they make it to the top of this place without having fallen to their doom. So your task as a therapist, that's a very generic task. The fact that kink has, sexy latex clothing and really nasty looking riding crops, and people are pierced 17 ways from Sundays with big holes in their flesh, and people have got ink all over them and all that. That's great showmanship, and yes, it invites sensationalism tremendously. And it's not that it isn't sensational, or not that it isn't different. Everybody isn't doing that. They may be all fantasizing about it, but not everybody does what they fantasize about. But the need to empathize with people who are doing things different than you would do is one of the overarching responsibilities and skills of a psychotherapist, and it needs work and development. And in that sense, I'm really preaching old-time religion that people have been using in talk therapy for over 100 years. Only the locale, only the new redefinition of kink as really well within the range of normal sexual vulnerability looks different. And that's not as new as it looks. Alfred Kinsey was telling us this in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So we've known that there's more sexual variability than there is social acceptance of sexual variability in the United States for 70 years now. And, I'm trying to help bring that to a speedy conclusion. And needless to say, that's a never-ending task. But the need to empathize, that is not new information, and I don't get any special credit for being the first person on the block to have thought of it. It's been thought of a lot. I'm just working to extend it to places that other people thought, well, we wouldn't have to do that because those are bad people doing bad things and they're really crazy. Not so.
Yep, couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks so much, Russell, Dr. Russell Stambaugh, ASEX sex therapist and ASEX certified sex therapist and kink advocate. So happy to have talked to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.